Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
the committee believes that more than sufficient evidence exists for a criminal referral of former President Trump.
The January 6th committee wraps up its investigation by referring former President Trump to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution.
A resurgence in the debate over school resource officers after a recent shooting near a high school in Pilsen.
To say this project was a massive undertaking is truly the understatement of the century.
The Jane Byrne Interchange finally nears completion after almost a decade. What commuters can expect.
Not only did I take on the job, but I took on the responsibility that goes with it.
An exit interview with Secretary of State and gymnastics coach Jesse White.
President Biden releases a plan to combat homelessness. We talk with homeless advocates about that and how they're preparing for the blizzard coming this week.
With holiday travel plan just ahead, calls for more federal protections for airline travelers. That and more from Cranes.
And vintage color photographs of Chicago people and places from the eye of Vivian Meyer.
But first, some of today's top stories. Chicago police release photos of a person wanted in connection with the shooting of 4 students at Benito Juarez Community Academy in Pilsen. 2 of the students were killed. Police hope the photos will help lead to the suspected gunman's capture.
All the students in this school, they need some type of support when it comes down to understanding the levels of violence and how it impacts a person's mind and how it lingers on for years and years to come. So we're going to need a lot of help over in this community.
Students walked out of school this morning to remember 15-year-old Brandon Perez and 14-year-old Nathan Villegas. There are now GoFundMe fundraisers to help with funeral costs. We'll have more on this story coming up.
Chicago is set to receive more than $100 million in federal funding to update accessibility on the CTA and Metra. $185 million in all is set aside from the $1 trillion federal infrastructure bill. The largest award for the city will be $118.5 million for the CTA to modernize the Irving Park, Belmont, and Pulaski stations so that they can be fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are another 42 CTA stations that are not ADA compliant. It's expected that elevators, ramp upgrades, and improved signs will be added.
A memorial was held for State Senator Scott Bennett today. The 45-year-old Democratic lawmaker from downstate Champaign died unexpectedly last week from complications from a brain tumor. Here's what Governor J.B. Pritzker said.
He infused humor into our lives while demonstrating the most enviable traits like extraordinary integrity and radical compassion.
Bennett is survived by his wife, Stacey Bennett, and 2 young children.
Coming up in the program, now that the Jane Byrne Interchange is nearly complete, how will your commute be affected?
But first, criminal referrals for former President Donald Trump, right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
The work of the Congress Select Committee on January 6th is winding down. Today, the committee took the extraordinary step of making a criminal referral of former President Donald Trump and other top alleged co-conspirators to the Department of Justice. Specifically, the committee recommended that there was enough evidence to prosecute the former president for major crimes against the United States, including inciting an insurrection.
Ours is not a system of justice where foot soldiers go to jail and the masterminds and ringleaders get a free pass.
No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office.
And joining us now with more are Patrick Cotter, a former federal prosecutor now in private practice, Patrick Collins, also a former federal prosecutor in private practice, and Harold Krent, professor of law and longtime dean at Chicago-Kent College of Law. Welcome all of you here back to Chicago tonight in person. I don't think I've had you all in person in many, many years, so it's good to see all of you. Patrick Cotter, let's run down the charges here. Obstruction of official proceeding of Congress, conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to make a false statement, and inciting an insurrection. Do you believe the committee provided sufficient evidence to support prosecution on these charges?
I think they provided sufficient probable cause. I don't know if they, frankly, provided enough evidence that one could conclude that there was sufficient evidence to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt on all of those. I think there are some serious hurdles they'll have to get over. But certainly they laid a basis to at least bring the charge.
So you say probable cause, Patrick Collins, does that mean there has to be criminal intent proven here, and is that a tougher thing for a prosecutor to prove?
All these charges, Paris, rely on intent, and that is, I think, the most difficult thing about this case, because you're going to have a guy, and I think everybody has seen him speechify about what was in his mind, and I think for a prosecutor to prove that his actions were criminal, intent is the whole ballgame for all the charges.
Harold Krent, what would it take to prove some kind of criminal intent? And was there evidence that the January 6th committee unearthed that might go that way?
But you know, he's impulsive, and his lawyer will be well placed to let him be impulsive even if he testifies at the trial, if he doesn't. And people can say he changes his mind, he goes with the moment, he doesn't plan ahead. And that makes it much more difficult to prove intent. And just to add one more thing, a lot of the evidence that was relied upon by the committee is not admissible at a trial as well. So the prosecutors will have both of those challenges. But I certainly agree with their comment that there is at least probable cause. But obviously DOJ is doing a lot of work now to try to bolster the charges to make sure that they can prove the case if it goes to court.
So are you saying a lot of the testimony that the J6 committee provided, that could not be used to admit into evidence?
A lot of it is I overheard a conversation.
Because that's the bulk of their report, are all those testimonials.
And nobody was subject to cross-examination either. So there's a big challenge in trying to be a prosecutor on these cases. But they've done a great deal of work, and we're all better off for it.
Patrick Cotter, what is the practical impact of having this committee make these criminal referrals to the DOJ?
Legally, it has no significance. It's not required. I don't even know that the DOJ has any procedure for dealing with criminal referrals from Congress. It has a political impact, I suppose, and I think it may cause the DOJ to feel some need at some point to explain if the charges they ultimately bring, if they bring any, why it doesn't match up exactly with what Congress suggested. But legally, it has no significance. DOJ doesn't have to do anything. They literally could ignore it. I don't think they will, but they could.
Patrick Collins, do prosecutors factor in public pressure in decisions like this? And in this case, it's a special counsel that's overseeing all of these cases.
Yeah, they shouldn't. I mean, I agree with Pat Cotter that this whole thing is just sort of infused with politics in it. This is purely a symbolic act. I could argue, if I'm Mr. Trump's lawyer, that this actually makes DOJ's process more difficult because you had they call it bipartisan, but you have basically a Democratic-controlled committee saying that the former president should be indicted. You have Jack Smith, the special counsel, following a pretty parallel track, and it frankly makes his job, I think, a little harder because the Democrats, quote unquote, have laid out a roadmap for prosecution. If Jack Smith follows something close to that,
although there are two Republicans on that panel, we should
again, and I think I'm talking about everything.
Your defense strategy, what the defense strategy
everything
might
is so political, Paris, in terms of this is a Democratic committee. Yes, there's Lynn Cheney, and yes, there's Congressman Kinzinger, but I think the critics of this committee. And I'm not one, but the critics of this committee call this a Democratic-controlled thing. And so if Jack Smith, the independent prosecutor, decides to follow the Democratic roadmap, then this is a politicized prosecution. So would say Mr. Trump.
And that is the case that the former president is making in response to this referral today. Although, Harold Krent, you have all these prosecutions of the so-called foot soldiers, as Congressman Raskin put it, and so many of them said they were there because the former president told them to be there. Is that more than circumstantial evidence or still just circumstantial?
I mean, it's some evidence, but it's not that there's a recording of his voice saying, go get a gun and show violence. There's a little bit here and a little bit there.
There's some plausible deniability. There are his tweets that say go to Washington, D.C. to my rally will be wild.
It'll be wild. Actually, that's right. And what's interesting, though, just to put it in perspective, is he's a former president. We've never had a prosecution of a former president. We've had a prosecution of a vice president, Spiro Agnew. And he's going to become a plausible candidate again in 2024. So this becomes very delicate for DOJ how to navigate these waters.
Patrick Cutter, are there charges here that seem to have a stronger case than others? Are there these charges?
Well, anytime a federal prosecutor sees 1,001 false statement, we always smile because that's our go-to. So I think that was probably added by some ex-federal prosecutor because proving a false statement is in some ways easier. It's more straightforward. And in this case, they're saying the false statement are any of these electors, these supposed Trump electors who came forward and said, oh, no, I'm the real elector. And they had to make allegations in writing that they were, in fact, entitled to be the electors. They weren't. So that's probably, if I had to pick the one charge of the four that is the most straightforward, the most simple, that would be it. But still, as Hal and Pat have said, the problem here is that you've got to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump intended to do all these things. And even though they put on a dozen people to say, well, we told him he really lost, all he's got to do is say, and now let me introduce you to Rudy. And Rudy is going to come in with 10 other Rudy-like lawyers, and they're all going to say, we were telling him that it was stolen.
But does Rudy have the same weight as the former Attorney General, William Barr, who said it was, quote, BS?
It doesn't matter, because as long as Trump can convince a jury or somebody on a jury that even if Rudy was wrong, he believed Rudy, and he believed the other lawyers who were telling him that this election really was stolen, then I think he has a very plausible argument that he never formed the mental intent necessary to commit these crimes because he thought he was, in fact, pursuing a reasonable response to what he perceived to be as a huge crime. So I think the 1,001 count is the most straightforward, but I think all the counts are still in real jeopardy, I think, because it really does turn on his state of mind. And I think with all of these lawyers and Eastman and Clark telling him, no, no, this is okay, Mr. Trump, this is all legitimate, I think he's got the makings of possibly a very good defense.
A strong defense. Patrick Collins, so we mentioned that the special counsel was brought in after the election in November, after Trump announced his intent to run again. He's overseeing everything on the federal level, including anything related to January 6th or the Mar-a-Lago Documents Committee. What does that say? Do you think that his investigation does parallel the way the committee went about his investigation, a.k.a. do you think he would be interviewing the same folks?
I think in large measure there's a ton of overlap here, Paris. I think one thing that jumps out to me at the report is there are certain witnesses who would not cooperate with the committee, who may have had significant information that Jack Smith could immunize and force and compel their testimony. And so in some respects, the report provides a roadmap for Jack Smith of people that may have important information but did not cooperate with the committee. And so I think that's an important piece.
I think they mentioned the former Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, didn't cooperate with the committee, kind of insinuating that he might be cooperating with the DOJ.
And Jack Smith has the tool that he can immunize. I mean, the committee can issue subpoenas. Jack Smith can issue a subpoena, but if people like Mr. Meadows who don't want to cooperate, Jack Smith can immunize them, compel them before a grand jury, ask them questions under oath. And that is a very powerful tool that the committee did not have.
And so there might be different evidence that the DOJ investigation has. What do you were relatively new into this special counsel process. What does that say about the timeline here of when prosecutors would decide whether or not to bring charges?
Who knows, right? The DOJ has waited a long time. The new special prosecutor has to get up to speed. But it has been a lot of work done by the committee, which will be of help, I think, to him. And I think he will need to go to additional witnesses and immunize them. But if I were him, I might try to do more surgically, go to something like the Mar-a-Lago documents case. It's not as complicated. It's not as dependent upon testimony. Intent won't be an issue in that case. And I might try to first go narrow while he's trying to catch up and develop the information for the rest of the charges.
What about you, Patrick Cotter? Would that be your strategy as a prosecutor? I know you're a defense lawyer now, but as a prosecutor, go to the narrow charges that are seemingly easier to prove with more evidence that isn't circumstantial.
I still remember being a prosecutor. I'm not that old. No, I think, yes. I think it would be wise for Jack to try and focus on things that weren't so easily rebutted by people coming in and saying, I told him to do this. Nobody's going to come forward and tell him, I think, that it was okay to have top secret documents, you know, in his rec room at Mar-a-Lago. So I think a more surgical approach, as Hal is suggesting, makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. See, I would argue the other side. I mean, first of all, he's got the sloppy defense on the Mar-a-Lago documents that I didn't pack these boxes. I don't know what was in them. Whatever's in there, blame the moving guy. I mean, that to me is almost as plausible as this defense. I really think if you're going to bring this January 6th related stuff, you got to do it sooner rather than later. They've charged 800 people with offenses relating to the breach of the Capitol. The Proud Boys case is going on. You have this report. This thing's been going on for 2 years. If you're going to do it, and yes, Mr. Smith has to get up to speed, but to me there's a time pressure that they should believe on this. The Mar-a-Lago thing strikes me, and again, we don't know what's in the documents, or at least I haven't read too much about it. That strikes me as kind of the tail wagging the dog, with the dog being, was democracy, you know, at issue there on January 6th, and was Mr. Trump the ringleader? And if he was the ringleader, then take your shot.
And that was the case that the committee made, so we'll have to see what decisions prosecutors make. Again, my thanks to all of you for being here. Patrick Cotter, Patrick Collins, Harold Krent, great to see you. And now to Brandis and how the completion of a long-anticipated road project could impact your commute. Brandis.
Paris, thank you. You may shave some time off your commute now that the construction on the Jane Byrne Interchange is coming to an end after almost a decade of construction. The long-anticipated project ballooned in cost to around $800 million. But the Illinois Department of Transportation says the interchange will improve overall commuter experience with fewer delays and crashes while also decreasing fuel emissions. Joining us now with more is John Basic, Engineer Program Development for the Illinois Department of Transportation. John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brandon.
So I think, you know, the big question on everybody's mind is what took so long? Why did construction take almost 10 years?
Well, the reality is that several factors went into not only costing more, but also taking more time. First of all, when the project was being planned back in 2013, the top priority was to try to get it done as fast as possible. So the planning team at that time looked at all the scenarios and said, yes, we could do it, but it might cause a lot of issues if we make those assumptions. But they did it anyway because we had to start somewhere and get a plan forward, identify some strategies going forward. And then as the design team kind of came in and started looking at the details, getting really into more detail on the underground situation. What kind of utilities are there to deal with, what kind of tunnels there are out there, what kind of soil conditions. They realized that it was going to be a significant undertaking with regard to the amount of structural work that was going to need to be done. And if we were to advance this schedule of getting it done as soon as possible, that would likely require large sections of the expressway as well as some of the overhead roadways to be closed at the same time. And that simply, once we started having conversations with the city, the CTA, UIC, those types of impacts were less important. They needed to make sure traffic was continuing to be moving through that area. Keep in mind that interchange carries over 400,000 cars a day. So the intent was we've got to get people moving and through and around the city. So we need to reduce and take a step back and break up the project into smaller contracts to get that thing done over a longer period of time.
To your point, John, about 400,000 cars per day using that interchange, give us a sense of how critical the Jane Byrne Interchange is to the flow of traffic.
Yeah, the Jane Byrne is a main access into and out of the downtown Central Business District of Chicago. In fact, it provides primary access to the Central Business District from the center, and then you have the I-55 at North USABA Lakeshore Drive on the south, and that provides a main access to the south. And then we have Ohio Street to the north. I mean, there's three main entryways in and out of the city, and this is the most congested and most traffic section.
Total project costs ended up ballooning, as we've discussed, by more than 50%, from $535 million to about $806 million. What would you say drove that price increase?
Yeah, some of the main some of the main reasons the costs went up as we got into the designs and looked at the soils conditions, which we knew were bad. Once we got into the detailed investigations, they were a lot worse than we thought. So that required extensive redesign of the retaining walls and the foundations of all the bridges. And we also ended up having to minimize some of the nighttime work, which required us to kind of, work longer and extend the duration of the contract. And another thing that was adding to the cost was simply the work at I-55 at DuSable Lakeshore Drive on the south end was going on at the same time when we were starting the Circle Interchange, and that was running a little bit behind schedule, and we didn't want two main accesses in and out of the city under construction at the same time. So we slowed the project down, which then adds cost because of even inflationary adjustments. So that delay added to the construction delay. And then there were underground surprises. We ran across underground water tunnels that were supposed to be empty that weren't. And we had utility impacts that took longer to resolve and took more money to address than we anticipated.
And now that it's nearly done, John, give us a sense of how commuter drive times are going to be shaved down. What are some of the benefits we've got here?
Yeah, so the main benefits to the motoring expressway traffic is that we're adding an additional lane on the northbound, southbound Dan Ryan Kennedy stretches of roadway. Then the ramp going from northbound Dan Ryan to westbound Eisenhower is giving an additional lane, so it'll be a two-lane ramp, and that's one of the highest traffic ramps that we have. So that'll significantly improve that. And then the eastbound and northbound ramp is also going to be a two-lane ramp, which will significantly improve that benefit. But then the other benefits are, to the community, the quality of life benefits. We are, all the bridges, the overhead bridges, neighborhood community bridges are all getting wider sidewalks, bike paths. The CTA stations, access points were significantly overhauled. Halstead got a really nice entrance, kind of a gateway, a mid-block pedestrian signal, a canopy over the roadway to better accommodate those transit users. And then the Peoria Street bridge and station for UIC was reconfigured and provided a grand entrance in and out of the CTA at that point and connects to both sides of these UIC campuses.
What remains? What else needs to be done? Because it's almost done. It's open, but there's still a little bit more to polish off.
Yeah, no, we've got some landscaping that needs to be done. That'll be done next year. And then as well as some electrical work, some sign work, and things that aren't going to require any major lane closures over the next year. So that'll be stuff, maybe temporary lane closures, shoulder closures, things like that really are not going to affect traffic going forward.
The interchange was originally opened about 60 years ago, and it feels like traffic patterns are always changing and growing. No chances of us outgrowing this one anytime soon, right?
That is exactly right. What we ended up doing is because we were able to add an additional lane of each direction, that adds that extra capacity to address and deal with the traffic that's out there today and provides a little bit of room for growing in the future.
John, of course, lots of holiday travel, some ugly weather expected this week. What do drivers need to know if they're heading through what might be, new territory for some of them?
Yeah, pay attention to the signage because there is a lot of new signage. There are new ramps that are open that are going to look unfamiliar to some of the folks that haven't been out there in a long while. All the barricades have been, removed, which, some of us, they were, kind of counting on those to kind of guide you through the whole construction zone. But now you got to make sure to pay attention to those signs, find your exits, and kind of keep looking ahead and making sure that you're also being safe. Watch your speeds. And again, of course, the weather slow down when it's raining or snowing.
Of course. John Basic, congrats on getting to the end of the road on this project. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brandon.
Up next, an exit interview with Secretary of State Jesse White. Stay with us.
How do we find resources we had no idea about?
The community seems to want us to be in this space.
There's plenty of potential to do that stuff and keep it within the neighborhood and keep it ours.
Next month, for the first time in 24 years, Illinois will have a new Secretary of State when former State Treasurer Alexi Janulius is sworn in to replace Secretary Jesse White. White did not run for re-election this year, and he recently caught up with our Amanda Vinicky, who joins us now with a look at White's long career. Amanda, there's a lot to dig into with this exit interview.
Yes, there certainly is, Paris. Secretary of State Jesse White has continually made history as Illinois' most popular politician, winning all 102 counties in multiple election cycles, as the longest-serving Secretary of State and as the first African-American to hold the office. But he was hesitant about entering politics back in the 70s when he says then-president of the Cook County Board, George Dunn, encouraged him to run for state representative, and in a district that was 85% white to boot.
So I told him, let me think about it. I have to go skiing this weekend. When I come back, I'll let you know. So there was a hill that I could not negotiate. Over about 10 years, I'd go down this hill, and I was unsuccessful in negotiating it. So on this particular day, I went down 12 times without falling. I said, if I can handle this hill, I can certainly handle the political arena.
White went on to serve 16 years in the Illinois House, representing what he says was the most diverse district in Illinois, covering the Gold Coast and Mag Mile, as well as Cabrini Green, where he'd grown up. He went on to serve as Cook County Recorder of Deeds before running for Secretary of State in 1998. Here he is at a pre-primary forum that March on Chicago Tonight, explaining why he'd be best for the job.
First of all, we're talking about experience, my administrative experience, as well as my legislative experience, far surpass that of my opponent. One of the things that I want to do in the office of the Secretary of State is to make sure that the office is user-friendly.
Winning that race was no given. That was the year then House Speaker Michael Madigan took over as head of the Democratic Party of Illinois. And Madigan, as well as other party leaders, backed Suburban Police Chief Tim McCarthy, who'd become famous as a Secret Service agent wounded in the '81 assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan. White says Madigan told him McCarthy would help Democrats keep control of the House by winning over Republicans. But it was White who won.
Beat him decisively to become the first Secretary of State, the first African-American Secretary of State in the history of the state of Illinois. Now you know the rest of the story.
After the election, White says he and Madigan did bury the hatchet. Now, White's full of stories. There was the time he took issue with his pastor, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., about King's non-violence-based plan to desegregate the Montgomery, Alabama transit system after Rosa Parks' arrest.
I raised my hand. He said, Jesse, wait, what can I do for you? I said, Dr. King, you know me, and you know me well, and you know I'm from Chicago, and we don't operate like that. He said, just follow the script, and everything will be just fine. So that's what I did, but we got involved with the civil rights movement.
White also has lots of stories about sports. Played baseball and basketball at Alabama State College, where he went when he says other colleges told him his 5'8" 8.5-inch frame was too short. It was despite his prowess on the courts at what is now Lincoln Park High School. He also graduated from college and tried out for the Chicago Cubs, and out of some 300 ball players, became one of 5 to make it.
And 4 days before going to spring training, I was drafted into the military. So instead of going to spring training, I ended up going to basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And while I was there, I decided I want to learn how to jump on airplanes.
He did 35 jumps as a paratrooper. After his discharge, he spent 7 years as a Cubs minor leaguer before going on to teach at Chicago public schools. But he he is perhaps best known for something else that happened after he left the Army. What started as a one-time gym show through a summer job at the Park District in 1959 became the Jesse White tumbling team.
And they said, well, the kids see a lot of value in coming to the park every day to be with you. They admire you, they respect you, and they want to emulate you. And you're saving a lot of lives with this program. So we would hope that you will continue. I said, okay, I'll go one more year. And then one more year. And here I am 64 years later with over 18,500 kids.
18,500 tumblers, many from underprivileged backgrounds. And to his knowledge, only 15 have gotten in trouble with the law. White says he has a tough love approach. His tumblers know they need to obey the rules. No drugs, do well in school. White himself isn't tumbling much anymore, but he told me he still does an old Army workout consisting of jumping jacks and push-ups. Now, as for his role as Secretary of State, White says he is proud to leave the office without scandal, having grown an organ donor registry program that's personal to him given a transplant saved his sister's life, and a graduated driver's license program for teens. And now you can book appointments online to get a license. White says he is ready to pass the Secretary of State torch on January 9th. But he says he'll be only a phone call away. And Paris, he is staying active. In June, he is going to turn 89 years old.
Tumbling into retirement, Amanda, what a story, what a history there.
Totally, what a guy.
All right, thanks very much. And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
What a career, Paris, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, with holiday travel just ahead, Illinois' Attorney General calls for more federal protections for airline travelers. That and more from Cranes. Addressing violence near schools, 2 aldermen give us their ideas for solutions following the shooting near Benito Juarez Community Academy in Pilsen. The Biden administration releases a plan to combat homelessness. We talk with local advocates about that and how they're preparing for this upcoming blizzard. And vintage color photographs of Chicago people and places from the eye of Vivian Meyer in an exhibit closing at the end of the year. But first, some more of today's top stories. If you're hoping for a white Christmas, you might get more than you hoped for. The Chicago office of the National Weather Service is forecasting a near blizzard with snow and dangerous sub-freezing winds. The snow is expected to start on Thursday, which is also one of the busiest travel days of the year. The National Weather Service says, quote, if possible, those traveling should begin to consider alternate travel plans. The blizzard conditions are expected to continue Friday and by Christmas Eve, Saturday. Wind chills between -20 to 30 degrees are anticipated. And if you are planning to travel this holiday season, you also may want to leave your pot at home. Even though more states are legalizing marijuana, possession of the substance remains illegal on a federal level. The Transportation Security Administration says marijuana products, including cannabis-infused items, must have no more than 0.3% THC to be allowed through airport security. TSA says if anything is found, it's required to report items that violate the law to local law enforcement. Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul is calling for more federal protections for airline travelers. A major snack company is selling its gum business as well as a manufacturing facility in Rockford. And a phone app company is expanding in Chicago and moving to a newly built West Loop office. Here to go behind those headlines is Crane Chicago business reporter Danny Ecker. So, Danny, of course, we know holiday travel on a lot of people's minds right now, and now there are calls for more federal protections for airline travelers. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so you may recall Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg proposed new rules back in August that would clarify when airlines owe passengers refunds for things like flight cancellations or big time changes. Well, now attorneys general from 34 states, led by Illinois' Kwame Raoul, have co-signed a letter asking that to be strengthened, to beef up those rules, basically. For example, requiring airlines to only sell seats on flights that they actually have enough personnel to operate. Also to ban them from canceling flights when they're offering bumped passengers, more expensive flights to the same destinations. These attorneys general really want to be able to actually enforce these laws and these rules themselves, but there's no sign that's going to be happening. In the meantime, the beefed up rules could be expected to be finalized early next year.
Okay, so we also have a major snack company selling its gum brands. What's happening there?
Yeah, Mondelez International, best known for making Oreos, as many people know it. They're selling their U.S. gum business for a little more than $1.3 billion. The brands include Trident, Dentyne, Bubblicious, among others. The buyer is a European company that actually does Mentos and Chupa Chups and some other candies. It's actually part of a broader move by Mondelez to focus more of its business on chocolate and biscuits. Also, the gum business took a hit early in the pandemic with a lot of masked, homebound people, and hasn't really come back as strong as some of its other businesses. So they've been trying to offload it, and now they have.
There's also a growing tech company adding its office space in the West Loop. Tell us about this company and what this move says about the downtown office market.
Yeah, it's a mobile app company called Fetch Rewards. They basically offer discounts and incentives to shoppers that take pictures and upload them of their receipts. They signed a lease to move to their downtown office to a new building that was just finished earlier this year on Randolph Street. Fetch has been growing. They got more than 225 people in Chicago now. This is in line really with the trend of companies flocking to new and recently updated buildings. That's where the leasing is happening as companies try to compel people to show up to the office rather than work from home. The downtown office vacancy is actually overall at a record high, but the vacancy among the top tier buildings has actually dropped over the past year.
A lot of changes downtown to keep up with. Danny Ecker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brandis.
And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
And Brandis, as we mentioned at the top of the show, police are searching for a suspect who shot and killed 2 teenagers and injured 2 more outside of Benito Juarez Academy in Pilsen. Students and community members rallied today calling for solutions to the city's gun violence, which has recently come to the doorstep of schools like Juarez. The incident also sheds light on the debate over police officers in schools known as school resource officers. Some schools like Juarez have voted to remove them, while others have elected to keep them. And joining us to discuss this are 19th Ward Alderman Matt O'Shea and 25th Ward Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez. Benito Juarez, by the way, is in Sigcho Lopez's ward. Thank you both for joining us. First with you, Alderman Sigcho Lopez, what is the latest we know about the victims here and the search for a suspect?
Well, at this moment, our community is still mourning the death of two boys, a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old boy, and another boy and a girl that were wounded. The investigation is ongoing, and we have no one in custody. We've been working very closely with our partners in the community. We had a meeting on Sunday to make sure, and we know the demands from the communities to make sure that we get this to the bottom of it. So we will be definitely working all this week, and we're definitely going to make sure that we get to the bottom of it.
I should mention we're looking at pictures that the police department provided of the suspect that they're looking for. Alderman O'Shea, remind us exactly what the school resource officer program is, why some schools have them, some schools don't.
Well, school resource officers are Chicago police officers who are assigned inside the building. In theory, what they should be doing is establishing relationships with the student body, so they know that they can come to them if there's a problem, if there's any bullying going on or worse. I think they can be an effective tool and they can be helpful. I have Morgan Park Community High School in my neighborhood, in fact, does have SROs, and the principal and the local school council believes that they've been effective in helping combat crime in the school.
Alderman Sigcho Lopez, you have been very vocal in the past about removing school resource officers from schools. Do you think having an officer in the school could have prevented an incident like this? And we should note that the incident did happen outside of the school, not inside of it.
Well, in 2020, the local school council voted to remove the officers, the SROs in the school. There was inappropriate behavior, and there was other incidents that I think prompted the LSC to make that vote. I think that we have had at least 3 other shootings in the city of Chicago outside CPS high schools where we had SROs and did not prevent the incidents. We still believe that what we need in our community, which is very different from that Alderman O'Shea's, we believe that these LSCs are very effective. We need, of course, to listen to the school community, which want to make sure that we rethink about safety. What we need is to make sure that we get investment, that we prevent these incidents by addressing conflict that is happening inside and outside the school. The 19th Ward and the 25th Ward are very different, But I think both communities deserve and need desperately the same investment, and that's exactly what we're asking from the city, from the state. That's on Sunday. Our community's mourning is also outraged, and we want to make sure that we have a conversation with the governor and mayor to address this issue of mass shootings. Just as the Highland Park community has done, we need to get to the bottom of it and dissect exactly what has happened.
You mentioned it's local school councils that have voted one way or the other for their schools on whether to keep these officers in schools. Again, this happened outside of Juarez Academy. Do you think the SRO program could have prevented an incident like this?
I think that the mere presence of a squad car of Chicago police officers could in fact be a deterrent. Clearly, whatever this conflict was, the offenders went there looking to do harm. And that's part of our larger problem. The flow of illegal guns where young kids, instead of resolving conflict with their fists, now resolve conflict with guns, and people are dying. And how tragic is this that two young students, two young boys, lost their life right outside school?
Alderman Sigcho Lopez, what about that? You mentioned the problems that some of these officers have had in schools. There has been some misconduct, but can having a cop car outside of school act as a deterrent for someone like this suspect who undertook this action?
Well, and again, I want to make sure that I don't speculate. These are the facts. There were at least 3 schools. Phillips High School, we got Kenwood, Simeon, and now Juarez. In at least the 3 other schools, there were SROs present in the schools. It did not deter. Again, I'd say it again. In our communities are very different. When we deal with conflict, with gang conflict, when we deal with things inside the school, outside the school, I don't see the effectiveness of having officers to deter. The investigation is ongoing, and I'm not going to speculate in this case. We're definitely going to make sure that we get to the bottom of it. And we need to have a serious conversation about safety that goes beyond having SROs or not. That is not the adequate conversation to have. Is what we need to do to prevent these incidents, just like in the community Highland Park has done. We need to investigate, dissect, and use best practices. And here, our students and educators who are looking into violence prevention programs inside the school and outside, and the coordination needs to happen. The police department cannot address these issues, and they have shown with 40% of the budget, they have shown that it's clearly not effective in preventing this kind of incidents.
What about that, Alderman O'Shea? Is the SRO conversation not the right conversation to have here? I mean, does it have to be about those other things, mental health treatment, violence intervention, and the fact that it isn't a one-size-fits-all policy? Some schools do well with them, some schools don't.
Well, I think it's part of a larger conversation, but I think it needs to be pointed out. 3 years ago, 2019, we had more than 13,300 sworn officers. Today, we're under 11,600. Once again, in 2022, we're going to see more than 1,000 officers walk out the door. That's not just retirements, that's resignations. Many of those officers are going to suburban municipalities to serve where they can partner with the community, where they can work with the community. And this is part of a larger conversation where what we've seen here in our city, in our country, is that we have completely turned against law enforcement. And the only way we're going to get out of this is if we partner with them, if we work with them. I would hope in this horrible tragedy we had outside Juarez that people are coming forward and sharing information with detectives so that the perpetrators of this can be taken off the street. But this is part of a larger conversation where we have failed as a city. We are not doing enough. We need to hire more police officers. We need to do more to retain police officers. And the administration has failed for the past 3 years on
this. This is a conversation that will certainly be ongoing, but we thank you all for now. Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez, Alderman Matt O'Shea, thanks for joining us. And now to Brandis and winter resources for some of Chicago's most vulnerable citizens. Brandis.
In Paris, Chicago is bracing for a blizzard, and dangerously cold temperatures are expected later this week. And with it, specific concerns for the city's homeless population. Chicago isn't alone in struggling with ways to address homelessness. Last month, New York City began involuntarily removing and hospitalizing those with mental illness living on the streets. Last week, Los Angeles declared a state of emergency over its homeless crisis. And today, President Joe Biden unveiled his plan to cut homelessness by 25% by the year 2025. Joining us now with more are Doug Fraser, Executive Director of the Chicago Help Initiative, a nonprofit serving the homeless, And Andy Robledo, he spent the last year handing out tents to the homeless throughout Chicago. We should also mention that we did invite the city to send a representative to join this conversation, but they declined. Gentlemen, thanks to the two of you for joining us. Doug, let's start with the most important question. We've got these dangerous temps and weather conditions expected this Thursday. Where can people go for shelter?
It's a really good question. And the answer is going to have to be into warming centers, to hospital emergency rooms, to hospital lobbies. There will be people on the CTA. There will be people in encampments. But the reality is at the moment we don't have the space for them. Pre-COVID to now, we've lost 20 to 30% of our shelter beds that have closed down. They just aren't there anymore. And in the last 2 years, I've seen a 14% increase in median rents in Chicago, which is forcing more and more people at the bottom rung of the housing ladder off. More people, less space. They're going to be outside. It's a really tricky situation.
And I want to come back to affordable housing in a little bit. But, for example, people who are just trying to stay warm this week, how long can they get away with hiding out in public buildings or like libraries or just riding the L indefinitely?
Exactly. They can't. It's a brutal way to go through things. If you think about the L, I think you get like a 43-minute sleep all night long before you got to get off, cross over, and go back again. It's inhumane. We have got to get flex space in place so that these people have somewhere to go.
Andy, you've spent the last year handing out tents to homeless people, but these aren't your standard camping tents. Tell us how they're different.
So yeah, they're completely different. They're insulated, double-walled ice fishing tents. So they don't typically have bottoms. So we build a bottom out of OSB subflooring and housing insulation. They stand 7.5 foot tall, so people can stand up, move around. It's almost like some people have called them little condos. But no, yeah, you can walk around really nicely. So. But yeah, they hold heat.
So cities across the nation, though, have been removing tent encampments. Chicago's had its own struggles. How has the city been responding to your tents?
So the first response, the response was to remove the tents. So there were tags. It made news a few months ago, but the city has since backed off of that, and they decided to let the orange tents stay.
Doug, what specific strategies could the city implement to help shelter more people?
So there's a couple of important things. One is creating flex space, opening up the warming centers more, making them safe, making them dignified, making them humane so people will go to them. The other really important thing they got to do is address the transportation and access into those systems. The current system calls for you to call 311. There are tremendous delays with that, picking up individually. So they got to change those strategies to a more efficient transportation system. They got to do intakes when people get to a warm and safe space, not when they're still outside. So people aren't outside on the phone doing intakes and then waiting hours for pickup.
We know today the president released a plan to decrease homelessness 25% by the year 2025. That's in just 2 years. First, how likely do you think that is?
I read through the plan, and it kind of makes me nervous, to be honest, because the focus of the plan is the same focus as we had in 2003 when we started the 10-year plan. When that didn't work, 2013, we did 2.0, the 7-year plan, same focus. And much of what he's presented is that same focus. And it's sort of like it hasn't worked over the past 20 years. You got to convince me it's going to work now.
So much of it focuses on people at risk of becoming homeless, particularly, or emphasizing that certain people are particularly vulnerable. For example, those who are leaving prison or mental health treatment or foster care. All that said, what would you like to see the government do to make a difference?
So, first of all, the prevention aspect that is in there, it's only one of, I think, 4 points. And it is where our attention belongs. But a disproportionate amount of the funding and the focus is going into the creation of these tiered structures of housing, going into improving the efficiency and the data mining of those systems, going into the same things that we've been doing now for 20 years. You're quite correct that the prevention is where we ought to be in supporting families that can help prevent homelessness in the first place and get people back off the street when it's time for that to happen.
Andy, how did you get involved with helping the homeless?
It just started with people in my neighborhood. So I drove around and noticed a lot of tents, and the conditions weren't ever improving. And as I kept passing by, I noticed more and more people started to show up, more tents popped up, and I thought, you know what, I need to get out there and see what's going on, see how I can help, and that's kind of how it started.
You know, we often hear about a lot of folks who are, you know, just a healthcare emergency or, you know, a car breaking down away from, you know, the entire house of cards collapsing, right? What did you hear from, or what have you heard from some of the folks that you've offered tents to?
Yeah, so a lot of the stories that you hear out there are very similar to the ones that we have. You know, me, myself, as an addict in recovery, like, I share very similar stories. It starts with heartbreak. It starts with a divorce. It starts with losing a job. It starts with, you know, getting hurt on a job and getting prescribed a prescription opioid medication. You know, so a lot of the stories you hear out there are very, very, very similar to, like, the stories that we all share, you know, and unfortunately some of us don't have the support system or the runway to get the help we need and, like, not end up on the street. Some folks just end up on the street, and it's really heartbreaking. So once I started to hear those stories and see the faces inside of those tents, that's when I couldn't stop going back, and I couldn't stop wanting to try to help to improve the conditions.
What more would you like to see the city do to improve conditions and to house the unhoused?
Like right now, the city needs to put people into hotels. So in any given night in the city of Chicago, there's about 67,000 vacant hotel rooms and apartment buildings, apartment units. So we need to get people into hotels now, follow suit with what the mayor in Los Angeles is doing. And in the meantime, help, like, if they're not going to do that, then I need them to help us improve conditions out in the field, get people warm, get people into these tents that we're building, get people propane and heaters. So yeah, but something needs to change for sure.
Doug, about 20 seconds left. The lack of affordable housing and its impact on the homeless crisis.
Sure. Yeah, it's exactly what's happening. When housing prices go up, you're going to see more people hit the streets, and it's going to be the people who have the less ability to adjust to these changes, and it's been that way forever.
Pretty simple, it sounds like. Doug Fraser, Andy Robledo, thanks to you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And we're back with more Chicago Tonight in just a moment, but first, a look at the weather.
When she died 13 years ago, photographer Vivian Meyer went from anonymous to fairly famous. The one-time North Shore nanny is receiving more posthumous praise, this time for a show of her mostly unseen color photographs of people and places. Chicago Tonight's Mark Vitale went for a visit when the exhibit first opened. Here's another look.
She took many images of children, sometimes the kids that she cared for. And she had a sensitive eye for Chicago buildings and infrastructure. There are scenes of the Loop in 1970 and the rubble from the demolition of the Chicago Stock Exchange. When she was alive, Vivian Meyer was unknown to curators and historians. Now she's getting the second show of her work at the Chicago History Museum. And it's all in vivid color.
We look across the spectrum of activity in Chicago and look for ways to reveal something about Chicago, Chicago-ness, the people who are here, what are they doing, how are they shaping how we think about the place we live in. Creativity comes out in a lot of these sort of questions as we're asking ourselves, you know, what are people doing and how are they sort of reflecting the city in that. So to look at this work, I think, is to reveal something not only about her, this amazing artist, and the quality of the work that she generated, but something about us as well.
If you're familiar with Vivian Meyer's work, you know about her self-portraits. She often found inventive ways to document her presence in the photographs. Most of these color works are focused in and around Chicago.
One of the things I really like about looking at her work is that sometimes it's not evident. You don't immediately see it as a Chicago work, and yet a little bit of time, you sort of capture a sense that this reflection is of that building, and you can sort of ground this scene she's photographing in context, in a place in Chicago. So place is really clearly important to her.
The exhibition includes a selection of Super 8 movies that she shot, including more on the demolition of Adler & Sullivan's Stock Exchange building. The works came from a donation to the Chicago History Museum by a local art collector who wants the pictures to be accessible.
She's able to walk that fine line between being sort of voyeuristic and dispassionate and being so empathetic that she sort of can figure out how to sort of live within that small, intimate world that that person is in at that moment, and yet continue to keep her art-making self on task, which is to capture this picture at the right time, with the right light levels, with the right framing, time and again. I think that that's one of the ways that Vivian and her history can inspire us, right? I mean, here is this amazing artist who never had the sort of critic's eye, never had any popular success, you know, in our culture, and yet was creating these fantastic works. And it gives me hope, right, that our world is more full of creativity and great art making, and, you know, maybe even something that comes to genius that we have time to elevate and recognize and give attention to.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
The show of Vivian Meyer's color photos at the Chicago History Museum is coming to an end December 31st. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Monday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thanks for watching. Stay warm, stay safe, have a great evening.
Closed captioning is made possible in part by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, wishing all a happy and healthy holiday season.